great. Okay, thank you all for your patience. We had a little bit of slowness of computer. And anyway, so welcome to HED Talks today. Here we have Dr. Wakefield, who will talk about successful intimate relationships. So without further ado, let her get started.
Okay, good to be here, everyone. Nice to see a couple people in person. So we're going to talk about the complexities of intimate relationships when you're very, very busy. And I'm hoping that you will leave with a couple of points that will help you deepen, improve, save your relationship. So this has been my key area of interest for about 15 years now. And I love working and helping people have meaningful relationships. So the first thing I want to start with is something I call the relationship roadmap. Something that most people don't understand is that relationships have developmental stages. And usually when we meet someone, we fall in love, we're actually drunk on dopamine at that point in time. We're a little bit insane. So I call that the enchantment period, where we're just totally enamored with that person, and we feel like they're everything that we've ever dreamed of, that we've longed for. And there's a little bit of a mutual admiration society going on where people are pinging back and forth, and I think you're wonderful and you think I'm wonderful, so you bring out the best in me and I bring out the best in you. And usually people either move in, commit their lives, or get married during this phase. Then they begin to meet what I call the rest of the cast, which has to do with all those dimensions of the personality that they hadn't met when they were enchanted. So now they become disenchanted. They become a little bit disillusioned. They become sometimes a little shocked to learn certain things about someone. You mean you actually believe that? Or the way you parent our kids, I was raised completely differently. This parenting style will never work in this relationship. So things begin to develop where you discover differences between saving and spending and night owl and morning person and all these kinds of things. Of how much contact should we have with our families? How often should we be having sex? All of these questions where a lot of disenchantment can occur. And then people fall into this stage of doubt where they wonder, did I make a mistake? You're not exactly who I thought you would be. So that's the disenchantment period, and that's where there's a fork in the road. And this fork in the road will determine whether people move into the struggle and anguish period or whether they actually enter into a phase of personal and interpersonal growth. Because almost all relationship problems are solved by growth. So if they're stuck in the struggle and anguish period, where I see a lot of people in my practice who are stuck in this phase, it's really trying to get the other person to be different. I want you to be who I want you to be so that I can be okay. I'm fine. I'm not part of the problem. Or on the other hand, I'm the entire problem. You're perfect, but I know I'm just a problem, and I don't even know why you're with me. So there's this sense that of finding the bad guy, finding the bad person, and very little sense that there's something that I do a lot in my practice, which is this back and forth and saying that in every relationship, these dynamics are interpersonal. Yes, there's personal stuff that's going on inside each of the individuals, but this interplay between the signals and the reactivity to the other person's reaction are going back and forth, and we can actually evoke a lot of threat response and a lot of negative dynamics in each other. So if you're moving into personal and interpersonal growth, you begin to move beyond early life defenses. So what are these early life defenses? Now we're in the realm of attachment. Whatever your experiences were when you were very young and dependent are going to start to get stirred up in an intimate relationship, because this person becomes the most important person in your life, which stirs up tremendous vulnerability. Sometimes I think it's kind of like you're walking through a lake where the silt has settled and it's not been disturbed by anything, and it's very fine and it's there on the bottom of the lake, and then you start walking through it and things start to get stirred up, and before you know it, the water gets very murky. There's a phase in relationship when this is what happens. We get stuff stirred up in us that was not stirred up while we were dating. We say things like, this only happens with you. It doesn't happen with my boss, with my friends, it only happens with you. It must be you. And so we begin to really have an opportunity to do some tremendous development in order to have an adult relationship. Part of this is developing the love capacities, which I will talk about in a little while. So there are a lot of challenges and there are a lot of rewards for actually becoming a mature adult person who can show up well and create a healthy, meaningful, enduring relationship. And as somebody who has now been married 33 years and has gone through various stages of enchantment and disenchantment and struggle and anguish and personal and interpersonal growth, I can tell you that doing that growth piece is really the secret to everything. It's important that we understand that marriage was different in prior times, that in earlier times, marriage was really quite transactional. We married because we needed security and stability. We married in order to raise children. If we were in small towns, our marriage pool might have been very small, and you were not marrying Princess or Prince Charming. You were just taking what was available there. In even prior times, families and regions and countries would actually marry their children in order to gain resources or to consolidate power. And sometimes these kids didn't even know each other. I mean, we think about the case of King Henry VIII and his marriage to Catherine of Aragon from Spain. That was really about consolidating political power. And then he went through a lot of machinations in order to marry Anne Boleyn and the other wives, none of whom fared very well. So modern love is something that came about during the era of the troubadours. This is where the concept of romantic love was actually born. And nowadays, we really want chemistry. We want to feel something about the person that we're with. We want a sense of connection. We want a sense of meaning. And most people go about dating with a bunch of, I call them box checkers. They've got, qualifications. You've got to have this, 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 and this. And if you've got that, and that, and one of them is chemistry, then we'll be a pair. So people go around and they share a lot of dreams of life. And in the early part of dating, and even in the early part of marriage, there are a lot of projections. Projections are things that start over here in me, and then I project them out onto you. So when we talk about the pinging of idealization, if things are feeling good with someone, we project that they'll always be good and that you're going to be wonderful ongoingly and you're going to fulfill all my needs and it's just going to be amazing. So we come into relationships early on with a lot of assumptions, a lot of expectations, many of which would never get voiced and aren't discovered until we hit that phase of differences. And then we're very disillusioned when we find out that we have differences. So navigating differences in a relationship is one of the most important parts of building a relationship. So this is where it gets complicated. So we've talked about that silt on the lake bed and how intimate relationships evoke our early attachment wounds and our insecurities and our deep, deep longings. One of the things when I'm working with couples I see is that people will bring in longings from childhood, needs that they had for being perfectly met, perfectly supported, seen, known, loved, understood, and they will burden the relationship with filling those childhood needs, which is an overburdening of the present relationship. It's really personal work that needs to be done. Granted, many attachment needs and many of our wounds of childhood can be healed in a good relationship. But bringing in everything that I always wanted and needed and requiring that partner meet those needs overburdens the relationship and it creates a lot of problems. So entering into the relationship, these unspoken assumptions, we think we know the person, but we only know the person that we were dating. We don't know that person when they're ill or when they have a downturn in their life or when there's a number of things that can happen. We don't know that person when they become a parent and how that's going to change them in terms of their identity, or when they change careers or hit 50 and decide that the mountain that they were trying to climb they haven't been able to climb, and now you're the reason, you held me back. People also think that relationships are about need meeting, and while in a good relationship lots of needs are met, relationships are not about need meeting. Relationships are about interpersonal and personal growth. And when we understand that and we have some compassion for the fact that we're both imperfect people who make mistakes, hopefully not felony mistakes, that we need to have a little bit of grace and compassion for ourselves and for each other, but also to be devoted to showing up as our best selves and doing our personal work so that we can be the best partners possible. People also enter relationships without ever talking about their fidelity agreement. I run into this all the time when they have different definitions of what being faithful means. Being faithful for one person might mean never having an independent lunch with a colleague that might be perceived as a threat. Other people are absolutely fine about their partner watching porn as long as it doesn't impact their intimate relationship. They have all sorts of different standards. In the military, I find that there's often an idea that when you're deployed, if you have an affair, I can understand that, but when you're home, you better not do that. So there's all sorts of different standards that people have for what fidelity is, and oftentimes they're not discussed. So there's also an assumption that when you're on that high of love, that love will solve everything. And people really do need a certain set of skills in order to navigate relationships. So my last book was called The Labyrinth of Love, and I outlined something called the 6 love capacities. So I want to talk a little bit about what those 6 love capacities are. The first one is commitment. And people usually think that they're committing to a person, particularly if they're standing in a wedding ceremony, that they're committing to a person. But you're actually committing to 3 things. You're committing to a person, to a process, and to presence. And that process is the process of becoming a couple, of coming to understand each other, and of building a life together. And there's lots of components of that, but you've got to commit to the process. You don't just marry someone and it's one and done. It's ongoingly, and as you get older and you go through different stages of life, that commitment and that process is going to continue for your entire lifespan. You're also wanting to commit to presence, and what that means is that even in a difficult time, I'm going to stay in. I'm going to stay present to you so that we can continue to work these things out. We're going to stay present to each other even when we're not on the same page, even when we're going through a really difficult spell. I'm going to stay in rather than one foot out the door. That takes a lot of courage. Now, courage is built, it's kind of like going to the gym. Courage is built as you use the muscle of courage. That means taking small risks and having them be successful, and then taking larger risks, and over time, learning that you can step out and take a risk, not only by staying committed, but by self-revealing. And self-revelation is actually one of the hardest things that people do. It's actually what creates intimacy. When people share their inner world with each other, that's how people feel close. I was doing a session with someone this week, and each of them was saying really hard things to the other person. The other person was listening and trying to kind of stay anchored. And even though they were saying hard things, by the end of the session, they felt closer because they were sharing their inner worlds and kind of staying anchored over here in who I am, and allowing you to be you and hearing where you are, what's going on, etc. Curiosity is a powerful relationship capacity. My colleague Ellen Bader often says that you should be curious, not furious. So anytime you're in trouble with someone, there are questions to be asked. There is something to be learned. Anytime we're in an impasse, we should enter into a learning conversation, not a battle, because there's something to be learned about that person that I don't yet understand. There are things with my husband that I only came to understand maybe 2 years ago, and I've known him for almost 33 years, but somehow 2 years ago a light bulb went on about something that had always mystified me, and I was like, oh, now I get it. And it caused me to be less reactive about this thing that I always thought was like way too invested in. So the curiosity, asking meaningful questions, not lawyer questions, like tell me why you did that. What were you thinking? Not lawyer questions. These are truly sincere curiosity questions, meaning I want to understand you more deeply. Communication is something we could spend the entire day talking about, and I'm going to talk about a few key communication tips in a couple of minutes. Compassion has been shown to be not only important in terms of relationships, in terms of saying, you don't have to be a perfect person. You don't have to be the person I thought you would be. You are you, and I'm learning about who you are. Sometimes I tell people that that disillusionment phase is actually the beginning of the real relationship, because now we actually know what are the raw materials of you and me that we can actually build a life together. And we've got to actually build a life together with what's real, not what we had hoped for. Compassion also applies to ourselves. Kristen Neff is a researcher out of Houston, the University of Houston, that has devoted her entire life on self-compassion, which means it has nothing to do with a lack of accountability. It has to do with being kind with ourselves and being honest with ourselves and being able to face ourselves with a certain kind of kindness where we can actually be honest about who we are, strengths and weaknesses. And the interesting research on self-compassion is that people who are more self-compassion turn out to be more accountable in relationships because there's less shame. You can show up and actually admit, oh my gosh, I didn't handle that well, or I've been doing this for years and I suddenly realized the impact that it's been having on you and on me and our relationship. You can show up more fully when you have self-compassion and when you have compassion for the other, because you're allowing both of you to be human beings, and we're all imperfect. The last important relationship capacity is creativity. In order to build a life together, you have to be creative. You have to actually say, okay, we have differences here. So what is it that where are we trying to go together? Who are we wanting to be together? What kinds of experiences do we want to have? And how can we really transcend this impasse into a third level of where we're really learning to be creative in terms of how we're going to create this life together, create this sex life together, create our parenting together, create and support each other in our goals and dreams. So John Gottman is probably the #1 researcher in relationships in this country. And he has identified what he calls 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And these are things that destroy connection and trust. The first is criticism. And that means that I'm just constantly evaluating you and finding you wanting. And I'm telling you, why do you do this? Why do you do that? I can't stand it when you do this. It's a critical attitude of picking on someone. And I always tell people, if you have something that's bothering you about your partner, always pair a complaint with a request. Always pair something that's not working for you with a solution, which is not an edict, it's not a commandment, it's the beginning of a conversation where I'm making a suggestion about something that's really troubling for me or I'm puzzled about, and can you give me more information, or maybe we can work this out. And there are certain things, for example, if you were married to somebody who has ADHD, they're probably always going to leave their towels on the floor. And so this could become a major marital issue, or they're probably always going to arrive home with the gas tank near empty. There are things that are going to happen. They're going to leave crumbs on the counter. They're going to do things. And you have to make an allowance for who you've actually got rather than who you wish that you had. And realize that there's a plus side there that you married this person for in the first place. And you're going to, two of you together in reciprocity are going to figure out how to creatively have a life together where we can make an allowance with compassion about each of our foibles. The next level is contempt. Contempt is really interesting because it includes eye rolling, huffing, it includes attitude and tone. Tone actually matters quite a bit in a relationship because tone lands in the nervous system. Certain tones like, I can't believe that you're doing this again, or, oh yeah, right, these kinds of sarcastic kind of tones, they cause a person to move into their threat brain. And when we're in our threat brain, we cannot be in our prefrontal cortex where we can be creative and have solutions for the things that we are facing. People also make global insults. You never, you always, you are this, you are that. And this contempt is particularly corrosive in a relationship. When people are met with a lot of criticism and contempt, they become defensive. And being defensive is a really problematic aspect of a relationship because when people are defensive, you can't exchange information. You can't creatively problem solve. Some people have so much personal sensitivity about the possibility that they're being criticized or found wanting, that it's not really an issue of being on the receiving end of criticism or contempt. They have a particularly escalated sensitivity, which is personal work. You have to be able to exchange information in an intimate relationship in order to make it wonderful. And likewise, there are times when people are not very good communicators. They're not using good communication skills. Learning the ability to listen beyond bad communication, listening under the words, under the attitude, into the needs, into what's actually going on with the other person and not personalizing it, is an aspect of moving beyond defensiveness. Another thing that people do to defend themselves is they stonewall. Stonewalling means I'm withdrawing and I'm not going to talk to you, I'm not talking about this, I'm leaving the room, we cannot return to it, there's nothing to be said here, or just utter and complete silence. There are people who deal with things by just going silent, and that's called a stonewall. And sometimes it's a good idea to walk away from an intense conflict, but it's important that if you walk away, you're doing it for the purpose of cooling down, self-reflecting, figuring out what you want to request instead of demand, and then returning with some creative solutions so the two of you can sit down and really engage each other without criticism, contempt, defensiveness, or stonewalling and get somewhere. So building a bond of trust and friendship is really central to intimate relationships. Trust takes time to build, and it can be destroyed by one felony act. So felony acts differ for people, but making rogue decisions that don't take the other person into account are wandering off into the area of felony acts. Usually we think of felony acts as things like making a big financial decision without consulting the other person, having an affair, quitting your job without consulting the other person, getting pregnant on purpose when you promised we were only going to have 2 kids and now we've got another one on the way. These are felony acts which really destroy trust. Lying, repeatedly doing something that you promised you would never do, hidden drug abuse. There's a number of what I think of as felony acts that really destroy the bond of trust and friendship. Misdemeanors, on the other hand, are things that should be viewed as learning opportunities unless they happen repeatedly after conversations and particularly apologies, and they just keep happening. That means that either the person is unable to keep that agreement and they're making it hoping they can keep that agreement, or they're just saying, yes, I agree, when they have no intention of keeping the agreement, and that actually is a felony act. So misdemeanors accrue, they need to be talked about, not swept under the rug. There are many people in relationships who let small things accrue until they have a big, very bumpy rug. And then oftentimes you have this small accrual of bothersome things and then a blow up about something that seems fairly small, but is actually just the collection of all these small problems that have happened for a long time. Couples need to play together. This is really, really important, particularly in your busy life. Go and do something that's fun. Fun is very important for building the bond of friendship in the sense that I like living with you, that this is a life we're building together. Having some sort of shared interests, which gives you things to talk about, and stirs up kind of a more youthful feeling of energy inside. That's very important. These are Virginia Satir's daily practices for nurturing the garden of love. Virginia Satir is a wonderful family therapist, and I love this prescription that she had. Regularly giving genuine appreciations, sincere appreciations, and thank yous, which can be as small as, thank you for picking up dinner last night. Thank you for helping me carry those things out to the car. Thank you for, covering watching the kids when I was sick, or when I was studying for an exam or something like that. I appreciate you for the following personal characteristics. Someone that is funny, or kind, or thoughtful, things that people that are inherently in their personhood, really voicing those kinds of appreciations. Keeping your partner updated, new information. I've got stuff going on, in my life. My parents are getting increasingly demented, and we're going to have to do something about that. I've decided that I don't like the career I'm in. I'm really starting to think about changing careers. I'm thinking about a couple I knew back in Asheville, and she thought she was marrying a college professor. And somewhere into their relationship, he decided to become an Episcopal priest. So now she's a preacher's wife, and she had not counted on that. It was not anything at the beginning of the relationship, but she did make the adjustment. But that was part of a process. Puzzles. This is the whole thing of being curious. I'm confused about this about you. I don't understand. Please help me understand. And concerns that are paired with requests and recommendations. They're not criticisms. They're complaints or concerns. I'm concerned about your health because of the following reasons. And part of it is I'm concerned about you. I'm concerned about me. I'm concerned about our life together. And then, of course, wishes, hopes, and dreams. And if you do this little mix, you're really tending the garden of love. Practices that increase trust is to do your personal work so you can show up as the best person you can possibly be. This is very important, to take responsibility for your part, not counting on the other person to make all the changes. We talked about this briefly. Don't agree to things that you know you're not going to be able to follow through on. Really, a person being able to count on the other person. When you say you're going to do this, it's going to happen. And there's both the elements of willingness and capacity. So somebody who is willing might have the capacity because they have so much going on, they just can't keep it in their minds. Someone who has the capacity may not be willing. These are two separate dimensions that need to be evaluated. So don't just say yes to be pleasing or to avoid conflict. Really look and see if you're both willing and able to do something. Make fidelity agreements you can keep. This is incredibly important about all sorts of things. It's not just sexual fidelity, it's financial fidelity. There's lots of fidelities in terms of how you're going to show up. And then absolutely have some shared enjoyments and play. So let's talk a little bit more about communication. In particular, how do you resolve differences? How do you resolve conflicts? The first and most important thing, which I find that people have a difficult time doing, is to use I language. Speak for yourself. Don't diagnose the other person. Don't mind read. Don't tell them what they're thinking, feeling, how they are. Speak for yourself. I was working with a couple this week, and it took me a long time for one of the partners to actually say what was going on for her, rather than trying to control the other person and say how they should be, and her concerns about the future and how this was all going to play out. Finally, she was saying, well, when you act that way, I feel anxious, and I'm really anticipating that in this social situation, I'm going to feel anxious the whole time because I'm going to be worried about whether you're having a good time and whether you feel included. Then we were in a valuable conversation, because then we're actually dealing with the real issue. Ask more questions. Get curious. Listen underneath the words to the needs beneath. People get upset, and oftentimes they don't know what the need is. There are needs under feelings, and it might be, who knows what it is, but they're talking about an issue. See if you can suss out what the need is. And if you can actually begin to help them identify what the need is and then work around that need, you can resolve a lot of things. Do not interrupt. Do not talk over. This is something that when people start to get upset, they do a lot of. So really practicing self-regulation, anchoring over here. Also, don't pontificate. Sometimes when I'm working with couples, I say plate-sized portions. Let's do plate-sized portions, not banquet-sized portions. You don't need to talk for 20 minutes to say everything that is wrong and all the things you want and all the history. Let's just do small bits of information back and forth. Because people stop listening after a while. They start preparing their response or how they're going to counter what's going on. Make requests instead of criticizing. Avoid blaming, shaming, labeling, telling the other person who they are and how they think, etc. And notice the meaning that you are attaching to your partner's words and actions. People attach interpretations and meaning to actions and to things that are said. And oftentimes, the meaning that you're attaching is very different from what that person was intending. So the difference between intention and impact is really important to evaluate, because good intentions can have bad impact. Sometimes bad intentions can have neutral impact that don't even, like I've been ignoring you for weeks to see if you pay me any attention, and the other person hasn't even noticed because they're so disconnected. So quick conflict turnarounds are moving from furious to curious and moving into a learning conversation. This takes a lot of practice and a lot of personal maturity and emotional regulation, because when we are in the midst of a conflict, sometimes we're either shutting down or we're fighting for our life because it feels like this is the most important argument we've ever had. I want this and you want that is not the end of a conversation. It is the beginning of an exchange of information. So most people, when they hit that, they just give up. So a lot of the work that I do with couples is when you want this and you want that, let's go one level down and talk about why it matters. Let's talk a little bit about the history. If there's intensity, there's always history. Let's talk about the needs that this would meet, particularly the imagined needs that it would meet. And sometimes people get stuck in the form. We have to do this because I want to have this experience. And the other person isn't able to do this. So now let's talk about, if this is what you're after and your partner's not able to do this, let's look at the portfolio of ways in which this need might be met. This experience might be had without getting stuck in it has to be just this way. So keep in mind that people are not usually arguing about the topic they are arguing about. It's about what it represents, which is a really important thing to think about, because people are rarely arguing about what they're arguing about. They're arguing about the 25 times it's happened before, or they're arguing about the fear that you always seem to get your way, or it's something else. It's not really the topic. Everybody has personal tender spots, which is why we have to have compassion and we have to learn about history. We need to seek to understand before being understood. This is something that in that famous poem by St. Francis, it is well emphasized. When you validate feelings, people almost always calm down. Just validate, validate, validate. Then get back on topic with what it is you're trying to. Never say you shouldn't feel that way. There's no such thing as you shouldn't feel it. Feelings just are. They're not you shouldn't. Feelings may be based on misunderstandings, on the fact that we don't have the facts. They may be based on reactivity from history, but feelings are real, so we can't invalidate them. In calmer moments, every couple, by the way, has a pattern of arguments that they get into, of repetitive arguments. However, in calmer moments, if you actually start to learn what the argument is really about, you can do something that I call creating an exit ramp. You can figure out when you're heading into one of these conflict cycles, and my husband and I have actually gotten pretty good at doing this, where one of us will say, let's not do this. Let's not do this. Because we know what it is. We've been around it 85 times or maybe 100, and we know what that argument is really about. It's about somebody feels like they've been doing more than the other person, or there are any number of things that are actually the underlying issues. And so let's get to what the real need is rather than arguing about the topic at hand. Work together to interrupt your patterns and see the dynamic as the enemy, not the person. The dynamic is the enemy, not the person. Return to a vision of where the two of you are trying to get together. What is it that you were wanting to create together in terms of being together? And who do you want to be in this relationship? How do you want to show up? And usually if we really each return to that, the vision of what we're trying to create together and who I want to be in this relationship, and then you'll figure, I don't want to be this person. I don't want to act this way, and take personal responsibility for that. Definitely increase your emotional regulation skills. Over the years that I've taught DBT to people, I learned so much in the beginning of teaching emotional regulation skills that I thought everyone in the whole world should take this program, just to learn how to self-soothe, calm down, tolerate distress, be in the moment, all those good things that the DBT program teaches. By the way, those of you who don't know, most of you know what that is, but this is a program that was originally developed for people with borderline personality disorder who are very emotionally dysregulated, but we all become emotionally dysregulated at times, even me. So if one of you or both of you are hurt, Consider the gap between intention and impact. Consider that you need to get into a learning conversation. If you're prone to distancing when you're hurt, how did you learn that strategy, and how might you learn to stay engaged, to actually remain present? If you tend to pursue the conflict, like, come back here, we're going to finish this argument, which can be very, very hard in a relationship when you're trying to convince or win. Notice how damaging this is to the bond of trust. Notice and examine why it is so hard for you to table a conflict and come back to it when you are in worse shape. When you're in a terrible fight, there are no adults in the room. There are only frantic children insisting that the other person be who they want them to be. You need to help me calm down. You need to be different. Both people are dysregulated. There's no resources available. Neither one is able to soothe the other. And the best thing to do during a terrible fight is to disconnect, calm down, and then figure out what the issue is really about, and then come back in a creative, regulated, problem-solving conversation and move forward from there. Learn to table conflicts until you can calm down, when you can consider what you want, why it matters, perhaps what the history is, and consider reciprocity. This is important. Sometimes you're asking something of the partner that is hard for them to give, hard for them to do. Consider the cost of that person really giving. This is a gift if they do what you want, if they make this change. Consider that. And consider, in terms of reciprocity is very important in relationships. For one person to not feel that they're doing all the changing, all the accommodation, all the giving. Very important. Most of you have heard about this. This is the 5 love languages. There are actually more than 5 love languages, but these are good umbrella concepts. And if you learn what your partner's love language is, it really helps with a lot of hurt. Let's say that one person, their love language is acts of service. I work really hard for our family. I do a lot of things around the house and, taking care of the kids so you can have time. Those are all acts of service which might take time away from the person for whom the love language is the gift of time. So if you've got someone who's never home in acts of service and another person who wants the gift of time, we might have a lot of arguments. If someone never says anything acknowledging, no acknowledgments, no appreciations, no words of affirmation, and that's the other person's, but they give wonderful gifts, for Christmas I bought you a new Mercedes, but they never say I love you or you're such a wonderful person. That person might say, I don't want the Mercedes, I want words of affirmation. So these misses can happen a lot. By the way, gifts should be well considered. They should be what the other person wants to receive, not what you would like to give. And they can be small. Like when my husband brings me home a blueberry muffin from the store and says, I know you love these. So touch is also very important, and we could do a long talk about sexuality and affection and the continuum of affection and sex and how confusing those are, and how when people are having difficulties with sex, they stop touching, and people can get very touch deprived, and people like different kinds of touch. They like to be approached in different ways. Certain people are touch-me-nots because they grew up in homes that didn't do touch, and they're just really uncomfortable with touch. And that person, if they're married to a cuddle muff, there can be a lot of difficulties in that mismatch as well that have to be worked out. So think of loving well means loving the other person in the way that they best receive and most experience being loved. Acts of love are defined by the recipient. So our last little idea is return on investment. So when you're incredibly busy, you have to think about, in the time we have together, what are the things we can do together that will really build the bond of trust and friendship and good feeling about being together? Why are we together? It's because we have these little islands of wonderful experience in the midst of our busy lives. You need to learn each other's operating manuals. We all have an operating manual, how we like to operate, what bothers us, what doesn't bother us, our gas tanks where we really have a lot of resource and where we don't have a lot of resource. Pay attention to what works and then collaborate. So these are 5 R's that I've outlined. I think replenishment is really important. Both rest and time in nature. Get out of the house, get away from the television. go get out into nature, take a walk, go to a park, go to something that involves being outside under the sky. Spiritual practices for many people are very replenishing. Spiritual practices together, going on a meditation retreat or something, can be a wonderful experience together. Reconnection, shared vision, talk, touch, things that really reconnect, particularly when you felt disconnected. Figure out your best ways of reconnecting. Doing repair. Sometimes we inadvertently injure someone. We injure their heart by something we say, something we do, something we didn't say, something we didn't do. And all that silt on the lake bed has gotten stirred up. We need to learn what that is with curiosity and compassion, and learn how to mend those attachment wounds so that we feel safe with each other. We need to learn resolution skills. We talked a lot about communication resolution, and we need to have some fun. So that is the end of my PowerPoint, and I would love to just field any questions that you have.
If anybody on Zoom has any questions, feel free to either unmute yourself or put it in the chat, and I will read it. Here. I will say all of my questions are probably too personal to for everybody.
Can you ask about your friend?
I
have a friend.
Asking for a friend. I'm a big fan of, there's a question in the chat, but I'm a big fan of love languages, and it's always interesting to me that misalignment and things. Is there anything out there on that? It would seem to me that people with the similar love languages would come together in relationships.
They don't.
They
don't.
Do we know why that is?
I think that people are attracted to aspects of partners that they don't carry. And so they tend to, opposites do attract.
Mm-hmm.
And even though we might seem to be similar on a certain level, there are differences that we discover that have more to do with the unconscious reasons why we find each other than why we think we're getting together in the first place. Yeah.
In the chat it says, are there any alternatives to DBT since that's very expensive?
Well, there's a wonderful green book on DBT that you could buy and read. You don't have to do a program. Just pick up a copy of, I forget who the authors are, but Matthew McKay, I think, is one of them. It's my favorite DBT group. It's a green book instead of Marshall Linehan's original red book. And it's a great resource of just, read that. And I also recommend that you buy my book, Labyrinth of Love, because there's a lot of information in there about how to deepen the bond and really have the relationship you always dreamed of.
I kind of had Dr. Crane's question sparked one in me. Do you see that it is coming? They always say that you end up finding people that remind you of your parent. Mm-hmm. Do you see that pretty commonly?
Yeah, I do find that people orient around what they know, what feels in their body familiar. It's not necessarily a conscious decision. It's just that when you get with this person, you just sort of feel in sync. People also marry the opposite. They're kind of like, I had a really neglectful parent, so I'm going to be with someone who's really affectionate. And then at some point in time, it's too much. It's like an overcorrection. So that has to get worked with. But yes, we definitely imprint on our parents' relationships. We watch them. We imprint on how they related to us, and this is all pretty much outside of awareness. Yeah.
Another question in the chat, not a question actually. I have read Chelsea's books and I will definitely recommend, so that was from Dr. Dean.
Oh, okay, thank you, teacher.
How universal do you believe these points are across cultural differences?
That's really interesting because cultural differences are very important in terms of the expectations, the scripts we have about how a relationship should run, and there are also some of the difficulties that I find into. See, if you're embedded in a culture and it's pretty consistent, it can be wonderful because there's the wraparound of a consistency of culture. it can be torturous for some people who want to grow beyond that. And so we see mental health issues with people who are stuck in relationships or cultures that something in them is just really pushing for a growth beyond that. And that can be a terrible inner struggle. We're having a conversation in the department right now about a particular cultural issue, and the person in that cultural issue who is really struggling with wanting to do the best thing for her mental health and yet having the expectations of the family and the culture. So these are really difficult issues, but they absolutely impact mental health tremendously.
Any other questions? All right. Well, that is probably good for our time. So thank you so much, Dr. Wakefield. We
You're welcome.
appreciate having you.
Okay.